Old farmhouse. When I was a kid, around the ages of 7 to 9, my family moved into an old farmhouse with my dad's new girlfriend. The house needed some work, so we renovated it to add another room for one of her daughters. I ended up in the old back bedroom, and from the very beginning, something about that room felt wrong. It wasn't just at night. I'd hear strange noises during the day too. To avoid being in there, I spent as much time as possible playing outside. But sometimes I had no choice but to be in my room. And those times were terrifying enough that I eventually begged my dad to let me stay at my grandma's house for the entire summer. One of the scariest moments happened when I was playing in my room, running around like any hyper kid would. Suddenly, I froze mid-step. I felt something holding me in place, completely paralyzed. I couldn't move, couldn't scream, and the only sound I managed was a choked whisper. The grip lasted about 10 or 15 seconds, and then it let go. I collapsed forward, falling on my face, since I had been balancing on one foot when it happened. I was hysterical, but no one believed me. No one except the daughter who had moved out of that room into the newly built one. She never told me why, but she believed me. After that, I started sleeping with the covers pulled tightly over my head, too afraid of what I might see or experience in that room. Then came the night that broke me. I was lying in bed, hidden under the covers, when I felt hands, cold and unmistakable, slide under me. They lifted me off the bed, holding me for a moment, then dropped me onto the floor. I was too terrified to move and stayed there, frozen, for what felt like 15 or 20 minutes. From then on, I refused to sleep in that room. I started sneaking out to the living room, pretending I'd fallen asleep watching cartoons before school. No one questioned it, and I made sure I never spent another night in that bedroom. Thankfully, the experiences stopped after we moved. To this day, I don't know what it was that haunted that room, but it scared me so badly that I've never forgotten it. The haunting. My first childhood home belonged to my grandparents. It was a 2-story house with access to the rooftop, typical for the rural countryside where we lived. The house wasn't very modern or developed, but it served its purpose. In those days, it was common for neighbors and family to come over to use our rooftop for laundry. They'd wash their clothes and hang them to dry in the sun. The rooftop also served as a storage area where we kept rows of 5-gallon buckets. These buckets, recycled from old paint containers, were mostly used to carry water. Growing up, my grandmother would always warn me not to play with the buckets. She made it sound like one of those standard safety precautions adults constantly remind children about. At the time, I didn't think much of it. But as I got older, I learned there was a much darker reason behind her warnings. A story she had kept from me for years. Decades ago, a tragedy had occurred on that rooftop. A mother and her young daughter had been doing laundry there. The day was hot, and the little girl, no older than 5, decided to cool off. She climbed into one of the buckets that was filled with water. Her mother, preoccupied with chores, left her alone for just a moment. What happened next was heartbreaking. The girl became stuck in the bucket, too small to tip it over and too deep to pull herself free. She drowned quietly. By the time her mother realized the girl was missing, it was too late. The memory of that tragedy lingered like a shadow over the house. As the years passed, my grandmother stayed in that home. She began to notice strange occurrences, small wet footprints appearing inside the house. These footprints were unmistakably those of a child. They would appear in the middle of rooms, starting and ending without any trail of dripping water leading to or from them. Even stranger, they would show up far from any source of water, with no explanation for how they got there. My grandmother never spoke much about the footprints, but her face would cloud over whenever she mentioned them. To her, they were a haunting reminder of the little girl who had lost her life on that rooftop, as if she was still wandering the house, searching for the life she had been robbed of. The crying child near a graveyard. I think it's time I share my own encounter with the paranormal. While it's not as intense as my grandfather's experiences, it's something I'll never forget, and I hope none of you ever have to live through. In my village, there's an old folklore about pishash, man-eating demons or ghouls that haunt graveyards. They're said to feast on the corpses of those who led unrighteous lives. But sometimes, they take the form of a beautiful woman or a crying child to lure unsuspecting victims at night. And if you're foolish enough to approach them, they'll devour you alive. We grew up hearing these stories. They were just tales to me, nothing more than superstition. Sure, I believed in jinns, but I didn't think they could harm humans under normal circumstances. That is, until this happened. It was 3 years ago. My friend Armin, not his real name, and I had gone to see a performance in a neighboring village. The show ended late, and by the time we started our journey home, it was close to midnight. To get back to our village, we had to pass an old graveyard, a notorious paranormal hotspot. We'd crossed that road many times before, but never this late at night. At first, we talked about the performance, laughing and joking to distract ourselves. But as soon as we reached the graveyard, our conversation died. The air felt heavier, and each step became slower, as if something unseen was dragging us down. Every noise around us, rustling leaves, distant wind, felt amplified, almost unnatural. Then we heard it. A faint sound, barely audible at first. As we walked, it grew louder and clearer. A child's cry. My stomach dropped. My first thought was, Pishach. My mind raced with fear, and for the first time in my life, I truly wanted to cry. I glanced at Armin. He was pale, his lips trembling. The most terrifying part? The fact that we could hear it meant it already knew we were there. We continued walking, unable to stop or turn back. Slowly, we approached the source of the sound. And then we saw it. A small child, maybe no more than a year or two old, sitting by the roadside, crying softly. We didn't approach it. We didn't even look directly at it. My grandmother's warnings echoed in my head. Never approach a crying child near a graveyard. Every instinct in my body screamed at me to run, but my legs felt like lead. I managed to keep walking, though every step felt like an eternity. As we passed the child, the crying grew louder. So loud, it felt like my eardrums would burst. Tears streamed down my face, but I didn't dare look back. Finally, when we were about 20 meters away, the crying stopped. I exhaled, my chest heaving with relief. But curiosity got the better of me. I turned around. There was nothing there. The child was gone. No trace of it remained. For a moment, I felt lighter. The worst was over, or so I thought. Then, from the graveyard, we heard it. A demonic scream, deep, guttural, and inhuman. That was it. We bolted, running as fast as our legs could carry us. My heart pounded so hard it felt like it would burst. I could feel my consciousness slipping, but I refused to stop. Not until we reached the edge of our village, where a few people were sitting around a campfire, playing cards. The moment I saw them, my legs gave out, and everything went black. I woke up the next morning in my grandparents' house. Armin had already told everyone what happened. When I confirmed his story, the reactions were mixed. Some believed us, others didn't. My grandmother, however, was furious. I got an earful for using that road so late at night. It's been 3 years since that night. To this day, Armin and I talk about it whenever I visit the village during vacations. I still wonder what would have happened if I'd been alone that night. Maybe I wouldn't be here to tell this story. One thing is certain, I'll never use that road at night again. A young woman that greeted my work crew. I hope this isn't too long, but I thought some of you might appreciate it. Back in 2018, I was working as a housekeeper, still am, just for a different company now. One day, my crew and I pulled up to a regular client's home, parking in our usual spot. The homeowners were an elderly couple. Very sweet and very old. This will be important later. As usual, my coworker and I opened our car doors, both facing the house. We sat there for a moment, chit-chatting about whatever before getting out. That's when we noticed her. Standing behind the closed screen door was a tall, blonde, long-haired young woman, wearing a white nightgown. She opened the front door, but didn't step outside. Instead, she called out to us in a cheerful, youthful voice. "The door's unlocked. Come on in whenever you're ready." All four of us in the car heard her, and we all responded with something like, "Thank you. We'll be right in." Nothing about it seemed strange in the moment. We figured the elderly couple must have had family visiting, maybe a granddaughter staying over. We unloaded our supplies and went inside. As we entered, we greeted the elderly wife, a tiny woman with a warm smile, as we always did. She didn't mention the young woman, but we didn't think much of it. We went about our work, cleaning the house from top to bottom. It wasn't until we were back in the car, getting ready to leave, that our team lead asked, "Did anyone notice something weird?" We all looked at her, confused, and said, "No, what?" That's when she told us that she'd casually asked the elderly wife about the young woman who had greeted us. The wife's response sent a chill down my spine. "There's no one like that here. It's just me and my husband." She even joked that she must have forgotten to lock the door if we'd just walked right in. The four of us sat there in stunned silence as the realization hit. We'd all seen the young woman. We'd all heard her voice, cheerful and clear as day. Yet, during the entire time we cleaned the house, we never saw her again. Not once. And somehow, it hadn't even crossed our minds to question her absence until then. For the rest of the day, we couldn't stop talking about it. Who or what had we seen? The fact that all four of us witnessed her made it feel so much more real. But the explanation? That's a mystery I still think about to this day. To be fair, the house is incredibly old, located in a historical part of the city. It's the kind of place where you almost expect strange things to happen. Maybe it was just one of those weird things. But I'll tell you this. I'll never forget the tall, blonde woman in the nightgown who greeted us that day. Ghosts in the ghetto. As a young mom, I couldn't afford much. Back then, I moved into a low-income rental unit just off 22nd Street. The building was owned by a slumlord, but to his credit, he was trying to renovate and had recently evicted some of the more problematic tenants. The building was half empty when my 3-year-old and I moved in, and the manager had become pickier about who they let in. It didn't take long to meet the neighbors. One of them was a woman named Rebecca. She told me about how her previous boyfriend had recently died from heart complications and how his friend Jim had been there for her during her grief. She eventually moved in with Jim, who lived in one of the basement suites. Rebecca wasn't much older than me, pretty, with dark curly hair and pale skin. We bonded over the shared struggles of life. She offered me a beer, but I declined. That was Rebecca. One night, I was curled up on the couch, watching TV alone. It was well past midnight when I heard a knock at the door. My first thought was, who the hell would be knocking at this hour? Curious, I walked over to the door and peered through the peephole. Standing under the fluorescent hallway lights was an older man. He wore a colorful short-sleeved shirt, khaki shorts, and brown sandals. He had silver, messy, medium-length hair, a bit of a paunch, and sad blue eyes. I opened the door slightly, and he asked, "Is Rebecca home?" I furrowed my brow, confused, and told him she no longer lived in this unit, but had moved downstairs to Unit 3. His expression shifted. Surprise, disappointment, and something else I couldn't place. He looked down at his feet, and I began to close the door when he suddenly said, "I'm thirsty. Can you please give me a glass of water?" The request was strange, but I nodded. "Sure, but stay there." I shut the door, locked it, and went to the kitchen. After filling a mug with cold water, I returned, unlocking the door. When I handed him the mug, a strong gut feeling told me not to let our hands touch. I carefully avoided his fingers as he took it, sipped, and handed it back. The moment I closed the door, my heart began to race. Something felt off. I peeked through the peephole again, but he was gone. I felt uneasy for the rest of the night, and guilt nagged at me. Why did I tell him where Rebecca lived? It felt like I'd given permission for something sinister. Soon after, strange things started happening. The dining room light bulbs burned out constantly, no matter how many times I replaced them. I even had management check the wiring, but they found nothing wrong. Eventually, I gave up and left the dining room dark. One evening, my boyfriend was over. The three of us were in the living room watching TV. At some point, he got up to make a sandwich. The kitchen was on the other side of the dining room, separated by an old wooden room divider. My child and I could see him at the counter, fixing his snack. As he walked through the dark dining room, my 3-year-old suddenly said, "Mommy, why is that man staring at us?" A chill ran down my spine. I asked, "What man? Where is he?" They pointed to the dark dining room. I looked, but of course, no one was there. Trying to keep calm, I asked, "What does he look like?" "He has big fat eyes, and his hair is like this." My child used their small hands to mimic wavy, sticking out hair. I felt my stomach drop. My child then added, "He's your friend who shuts off the lights." I shuddered, wrapping them tightly in a blanket. My boyfriend, still in the kitchen, froze mid-slice when he heard that. The rest of the night, I stayed awake, watching over them, unable to shake the feeling that whatever, or whoever, my child had seen wasn't just in their imagination. Deceased father-in-law. My father-in-law passed away suddenly 6 months ago in his 50s. He was a lifelong mechanic with a passion for restoring old British sports cars. He owned every tool known to mankind, but had zero sense of organization. Despite that, he had an uncanny ability to find anything. You could ask him where the most obscure tool was, and he'd guide you to it without fail. Without his help, though, finding anything among his labyrinth of boxes, benches, and drawers felt impossible. Last week, I was repairing our hot tub and needed an Allen wrench. The 7mm was too small, and the 8mm was too big. For anyone who doesn't deal with tools, you should know. Nothing ever uses a 7.5mm Allen wrench. It's basically a myth, a unicorn of the tool world. My 18-month-old son, Will, was with me while I searched through my garage. It's now home to my father-in-law's extensive tool collection. 6 waist-high rolling chests and stacks of boxes that could probably outfit an entire F1 team. I was going through drawer after drawer, trying to find a miracle in the form of a 7.5mm Allen wrench. As I'm digging, Will toddles off to the other side of the garage, where an unopened cardboard box sat untouched. He goes straight to it, pulls out a floppy plastic roll of pockets, filled with random nuts, bolts, and electrical connectors, and waddles back to me with it. Right in the middle of that plastic roll, among all the odds and ends, was a single Allen wrench. I pick it up, and you guessed it. It was a 7.5mm Allen wrench. Will just smiled at me, proud of his find, and handed it over like he knew exactly what I needed. Now, I don't know much about God or the afterlife, but I'm certain my father-in-law guided my toddler to that wrench. Out of the countless boxes and drawers in that garage, my 18-month-old somehow went straight to the one thing I thought I'd never find. It's moments like this that make me wonder if the people we've lost are still with us, helping us. I had an imaginary friend. This is a short story. My mom told me, but it still freaks me out. When I was 3 years old, my mom came into my room one evening and told me dinner was ready. She had made spaghetti. As we walked to the kitchen, I casually mentioned that my friend would like some too. My mom, assuming it was just an imaginary friend, smiled and said, "Well, her mommy will have to make her some." Without hesitation, I replied, "Her mommy didn't come back for her after she died." My mom froze, horrified, but didn't say anything at the time. She figured it was just the strange imagination of a toddler. A few days later, She walked into my room while I was playing by myself. I was staring at the ceiling, completely focused. Curious and slightly uneasy, my mom asked what I was looking at. "Oh," I said matter-of-factly. "I'm just watching the lady crawling around on the ceiling." We moved out a month later. Haunted by the past. My husband passed away in August 2020, and after his death, I discovered a series of deeply upsetting truths about him. It was devastating, so much so that it took me over 3 years to come to terms with it all. He had spent years renovating our condo, the kitchen, both bathrooms, flooring, trim, doors, everything. By June 2021, I decided to sell it and start fresh. The condo had been his project, and being there became unbearable. One day, when a potential buyer was scheduled to view the property, I grabbed my 2 small dogs, locked the door, and left the building as instructed by the realtor. I was told to stay out for about 30 minutes. When I returned, the front door was still locked, just as I'd left it. But inside, things were off. Doors were moved, and the barn doors for the laundry, which I distinctly remembered closing, were wide open. I even got a text from the realtor asking why I hadn't left the key in the lockbox outside. The buyers had been unable to get in. Confused and uneasy, I walked into the main bathroom and found the bath mat draped over the tub, not where I'd left it. When I touched it, it was damp, as though someone had recently stepped out of the shower. After he died, I often heard noises in the kitchen late at night. It wasn't a building where you could hear your neighbors. It was concrete construction, silent, but still, I'd lie in bed, too afraid to investigate. In June 2021, I moved to a new condo, hoping for a fresh start. The first night there, I was alone. My dogs were staying elsewhere. As I lay in bed on my side, not quite asleep, I felt something brush past me. My hair moved. Paralyzed with fear, I lay still for what felt like forever. The strange occurrences didn't stop. Last Christmas Eve, in yet another home far from where I'd lived with him, I heard 3 distinct knocks on my open bedroom door. Twice. The sound was clear and deliberate. It terrified me. That night, I spoke out loud, telling him to leave me alone. Since then, thankfully, the unsettling experiences have stopped. These last 4 years have been a whirlwind of grief, revelation, and fear. A sign from beyond. A little backstory first. My dad passed away in 2006 after suffering a massive stroke. Growing up, my parents divorced when I was 10, and my siblings and I spent weekends with him in the small town he moved to. It wasn't much of a place, just a tiny community with one restaurant. Around Christmas in 1989, my older brother gave my dad a Zippo lighter as a gift. It had a small rectangular gold plate engraved with my dad's initials, MRF. My dad wasn't much of a cook. His specialty was elbow pasta with stewed tomatoes and sweet and low. So we often ended up eating at that little restaurant when we were with him. Fast forward to 2010, 4 years after my dad had passed. My brother happened to be driving through that same town with a friend. On a whim, they decided to stop and eat at the restaurant where we used to go as kids. As my brother got out of the car, something shiny on the ground caught his eye. Thinking it might have been something he'd dropped, he bent down to pick it up. When he saw what it was, he froze in disbelief. It was the gold plate from Dad's Zippo lighter, the one with MRF engraved on it. Let that sink in. Over 15 years had passed since any of us had been to that restaurant. Somehow, in all that time, the little gold plate had managed to stay there, unnoticed, until the exact moment my brother happened to visit.